a very wise ex-boss of mine had a really great line on this, which was, just because you invent the cheddar engine doesn't mean that the laws of physics have changed. And I think we all know that the tools that we have available to us are evolving, and anyone who claims to be an expert in AI marketing tools will not be an expert next week. The thing that anchored me was the principle of partnership. I think the mistake that maybe I made, sometimes other people have made, is treating it more like client service. And especially when it's ambiguous and you're trying to win locally and you know that that's where the rubber hit the road, you kind of end up feeling like you're serving the local markets. And
if you were going to give one piece of advice to a marketer leading internationally or about to step into an international role, what would be your single greatest piece of advice to help someone be successful in that role?
I would say, if budgets permit.
Welcome to The Global Marketing Leader. I'm Andrew Garrihy, a former global CMO turned executive coach for marketing leaders. This is the podcast where we get honest about what it takes to lead global marketing teams and to build global brands that grow responsibly whilst lifting the communities within which they operate.
In a crisis, the only mission was to get the nappies to the babies. That clarity changed how Noam leads today. The Global Marketing Leader podcast gives ambitious marketers the confidence, the clarity, and the inspiration to lead internationally through real conversations with international marketing leaders who have been there and done that. Marketing leaders who build brands, cultures, and teams that perform across borders. Today, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Noam Buchalter, an international marketing leader with over 20 years experience across FMCG organizations, including Unilever and Kimberly Clark. Noam has led innovation and portfolio marketing across EMEA in baby and childcare, and he's also been at the front of progressive brand experimentation and innovation. He's also a thoughtful voice on caring leadership and shared value. And we're going to get really practical on what that actually looks like day to day. Noam, welcome. It's so great to have you here. I've been so excited about this. I woke up this morning like, I can't wait to have this discussion. Obviously, I've got to know you recently and I've got to understand some of your experience, which is just really inspiring. And so I can't wait today to share some of that with our listeners. But before we do that, why don't you give me a quick kind of 2-minute overview of your career story, kind of the key moves, the roles you've had, and kind of what some of those experiences have taught you about leading marketing internationally.
Yeah, of course. And first of all, I'm super excited to be with you as well, Andrew. And I really enjoyed getting to know you. And it's a massive privilege to be with you on this podcast. So thank you for having me. So really, overall, my career has been about turning around and accelerating established brands, and doing that with that careful performance leadership style, building high-performing marketing teams. And I've covered the full spectrum of the marketing mix in my time. But I really specialize, I would say, in brand strategy, innovation, and that shared value, the social impact and environmental sustainability. So I started my career with Unilever on the graduate scheme in marketing in the UK foods business and progressed through various amazing brands that they have, ultimately landing with a portfolio of Marmite, Pot Noodle, Pepperami, and Bovril. So that just gave me a fantastic grounding in all the fundamentals of marketing and a lot of freedom to innovate, experiment, and learn. Then I had an opportunity to move into marketing strategy and capability consulting and a couple of private equity owned brands as well. So that really broadened my horizons and also gave me that commercial edge and that kind of tactical nous as well, which I still refer to and is still super valuable right to this day. And then ultimately, I joined Kimberly Clark, and that was my first international marketing role. And I started in the toilet tissue brands. So the likes of Andrex, that people in the UK will know, but Scottex and lots of different brand names across EMEA. So super diverse region. And having succeeded with quite a few projects, which we might talk about today, I was then promoted to my first marketing director job in the really core baby and childcare category, looking after Huggies baby wipes and various specialist brands like Dry Nights for bedwetting. And having done a few more great projects and learnt a lot more there, I then got unleashed on the big $1 billion Huggies Diapers business. And again, a business that everyone's got eyes on, all stakeholders have got eyes on that. A lot of pressure, but a lot of fun as well.
Wow. That's super impressive. And we're definitely going to dive into some of that today. But what's the thread that connects kind of your journey through those different roles? If there was a thread there, what's the kind of role, that thread that connects everything?
Yeah, I think it's a really strong belief in the fundamentals of marketing. So from a functional perspective and taking that kind of 4P marketing point of view overall, always. And a very wise ex-boss of mine had a really great line on this, which was, just because you invent the jet engine doesn't mean that the laws of physics have changed. And I think we all know that the tools that we have available to us are evolving, and anyone who claims to be an expert in AI marketing tools will not be an expert next week. So that, there's lots of great people we can refer to and learn from, but having rooted in us those fundamentals of consumer insight and building brands for the long term, activating them in the short term, all those things I know we all know is what I kind of hold on to through all the uncertainty. So if that's from a functional perspective. And then I think from a leadership perspective, I think we'll talk a little bit more about this, but a really strong belief that people who feel cared for have a much higher capacity to care for other people and the work they're doing, and to really see that connection and to live that connection of care leading to performance. And then the magic that happens when those team members feel cared for, they start caring for you as a leader as well. And those human connections and relationships just kind of lead to even better things.
Brilliant. I love what you said about, just because you've created the jet engine, the laws of physics doesn't change. Because I think in marketing, that's one of the critical things, right? Every week we've got some guru telling us to do things differently, or marketing's changed, or this role is dead, or that role is dead, or, everything's going to be different. But it doesn't, right? The fundamentals of marketing remain the same. The tools change, right? And we can use the tools differently, but the fundamental critical discipline of professional marketing hasn't changed that much. It's just the tools we use. So I love that. Right. Today we're going to cover really 3 key areas. We're going to talk first about that for all international leaders, that big challenge, which is kind of how do you structure? Who does what? What happens in HQ? What happens in region? What happens in local? Who leads? What's the right model? We're going to step into a bit of your experience in that. And then second, we're going to look at innovation. So in these international roles, how do you drive real innovation across region or country, especially when you're constrained? And then lastly, we're going to come back to your leadership style and what you kind of practice and this philosophy you have around care for performance. And we'll dive into what that looks like and how you bring that to life. So let's get into it. The big one. Let's get into this global, regional, local setup, decision rights, trade-offs, the perennial problem for international. What's your view on this? Like, what's been your experience with this?
Well, I think the first thing really is to accept that it's a paradox. Okay. And that paradox doesn't have a solution, right? So I think that's the first thing is you'll never get it right. You're just searching for the best version of, I think. And that can change and that can evolve. I had a really interesting position in that I was in a regional team at Kimberly Clark. And I spent well over a decade in EMEA, which is a very diverse region, right? So it's almost a microcosm in itself anyway. But I had really fantastic global colleagues and really fantastic and dedicated local activation partners as well. So I kind of saw the full spectrum. I wasn't at one end or the other. I was kind of in the middle of it all, which was a really privileged position. I really enjoyed it. And I guess a really fundamental principle that I learned, because there can be a lot of ambiguity, right, about roles and responsibilities. And some companies are very command controlled and other companies might be much more decentralized. I would say Kimberly Clark was more on the decentralized bit. There wasn't necessarily a written Darcy, racy, whatever you want to call it. And so you kind of would be feeling your way through it. So it can be super tough, right? But I think the thing that anchored me was the principle of partnership. I think the mistake
So
that
true.
maybe I made sometimes, other people have made, is treating it more like client service. And especially when it's ambiguous and you're trying to win locally and you know that that's where the rubber hit the road, you kind of end up feeling like you're serving the local markets. And the local markets are the ones with the best perspective on their consumers, right? But that's just one group, and there's many priorities and many business and growth opportunities across a very diverse region. So they inevitably have a very deep but quite limited perspective. And so there is a richness and a value that regional and global teams bring. So I prefer to look at it much more in the sense of partnership. And for me, partnership is about two or more groups of people who have very distinct high value add, and they respect each other's added value, and they see that that is actually incremental, and the total is more than the sum of the parts. And so I think that sort of partnership working in that language and that behavior is super important to be able to be kind of flexible and agile. And then you're going in constantly knowing that everyone's got good intentions, that you're working as partners, you each have a really valuable perspective and contribution to make. So I guess that's kind of the principles. And then I think I had an experience where I really learned about kind of how to kind of balance different markets as well. So, when I was working on Huggies, there was, the largest market, and I won't go into too much detail, right? But there was a very large market that was treated as a lead market. So this lead market model is a very common model in kind of global international marketing. And it makes a lot of sense because you do want the go-to-market perspective, even in the very earliest front-end innovation and brand strategy work. You want that local perspective. So having a close partnership with the market is super, super valuable. The challenge was that this particular very large market had not a unique, but a certain perspective and priorities, say, around super premium, and then a particular format of nappies called nappy pants, right? So they were super into that. And when I came into that marketing director role, they'd effectively, you could see that they'd molded the entire 3 to 5 year innovation roadmap around these two priorities, the super premium skincare and these kind of nappy pants. And yet there were other very significant markets in the EMEA region whose 80% of their business was in the mainstream open diapers, so the ones with the tabs on them, right? And there'd been no major innovation on that part of the portfolio for 5 years when I turned up. And so I recognized that actually this model of lead market was actually leading the entire region, this one market. And it's almost as if even for them, they were almost doing more work than they should have done, right? And they were struggling to kind of focus on the go-to-market and activation. So it wasn't doing anyone any favors. And so I shifted the perspective across the region to what I then called was key market partner. And you would then, as the regional team, would decide which is the most sensible key market partner for initiative A or innovation B. And so, when it was to do with super premium skincare, this market that I'm talking about would absolutely be the key market partner, front-end innovation all the way through to execution. But when it came to the open diapers mainstream, market B, the other big market, would be leading that. And so suddenly we ended up with a much more balanced innovation plan. And in that market B, who had lost about 200 or 300 basis points of market share because of this lack of core innovation, We
Wow.
managed to deliver that at a cost neutral, a really fantastic core renovation, improvement of that core portfolio. And within 6 or 9 months, 300 basis points of share had returned to that business because they were super committed to it. They activated it. They got exactly what they needed. And we still had premium innovation that was driving share growth as well. So it was a triple multiple win just by changing that perspective from client service of one very large market as lead market to key market partner serving all the markets and actually partnering with them on their key priorities. And so that's kind of really shaped how I approach that kind of regional, global to local relationship, partnership and partnering on specifics rather than on everything.
I love that. So, okay, so there's a couple of things. There's a lot in there. No, but you started by saying the key was about partnership, and you explain what partnership looked like, but also in there about mutual respect. In my experience, that is probably the most fundamental and critical thing. And if you've got a partnership based on mutual respect and an attitude that is orientated towards making it work, that's probably the single most important thing, right? To your point, races and daces, it's all very important. In fact, I'm working on that for a client right now.
Yeah.
But actually, the core thing is that partnership and that mutual respect. I also love that. I mean, FMCG, you guys are masters at this and have been doing global and international marketing across diverse marketings probably longer than any other industry. I love that. That pivot from kind of a really rigid focus on lead market to what do you call it? Key markets.
Yeah, key market partner. So you'd have a key market partner for a specific strategy, initiative, innovation, but you choose, and it would be aligned with their priorities, right? And obviously the overall global business priorities. So it's a much more flexible, much more agile and more tailored approach. And then with that mutual respect of partnership. And, I so agree with what you're saying. And it's a very human thing as well. It's about getting out there, showing your commitment as a regional person, getting to that market multiple times, working sessions, going out for meals and drinks, market visits, store visits in FMCG. That actually shows the mutual respect, and that builds the relationship and builds the mutual respect.
I agree. There's just no substitute for being in market and building those direct relationships. The other thing I liked about the model you talked about is it reflected and it adapted to the diversity of the markets in that region. I mean, that is an incredibly diverse region, as you've highlighted in that example. And I love the way that model of key partner allows you to really focus on what is right for their market. Right? Still good for the brand overall, still quite consistent, but you can double down on what's going to drive the real growth in their market and make sure you get the right focus on the right innovations for that particular market. So I think that's a brilliant example. In your experience, when does it go really wrong? What really gets in the way and makes it a bit of a mess?
Yeah, I think another very wise boss of mine said that the key to relationship breakdown usually is misaligned expectations. So, I've had, and sometimes it's just about individuals. Sometimes it's about teams and systems. I've actually found often it's about individuals. Again, not that they're bad people and they all have good intentions, but they just have a misaligned expectation of, what their role is, what the regional global team's role is. And I've just kind of I found myself constantly bumping up against, and sometimes it's just individuals. And you think, I'm still me, and this is still my team, and we have these incredible relationships with this other market or all these other markets, and there's just one market here or two markets where we're struggling. So what's the common denominator here, really? And I think, where I've had that experience, we've and I've partnered then with the local marketing leader and really aligned with that leader, and then did a kind of a team session where we actually sometimes you have to just dip into the Darcy or the Racy a little bit and be a little bit technical just to get those expectations realigned. But then you get back up to the human level, and everyone gets the sense that, oh no, actually, this is a partnership. This is not a battle. Nobody knows the local market better, and nobody understands those consumers better than the local team. And nobody understands the fundamentals of the insight, the innovation, and where the regional or global priorities sit, and so on and so forth, and where this all, how do we invest? Than the regional team, right? So we both bring, and we have incredible resources that we bring to bear as well. So when people feel and see that, that's when you start getting the breakthroughs. And I've had that with multiple markets. And then it also just becomes a joy to work with people, because it should be fun, right? We're so privileged to do this job.
Exactly.
It's like a game that I take seriously, really. It's sort of such a privilege. There's people doing far more important things in the world than us lot, right? So it should also be fun. And I think, getting those expectations aligned, really getting people to see that this is a partnership for success, just makes it a lot more fun.
I think that's a really important point, because I've done lots of these roles. I coach lots of marketing leaders who are doing these roles. And there's always one market. There's always at least one market that just doesn't work. And you're right. It's often personality. But the point you made is really important, right? This is where we still need the races and daisies and real clarity on who does what. Obviously, those things don't work without respect and partnership, but you still need them. They're still practical, especially when you've got challenges or markets that the relationship is not great, because there is always one market. So I think your approach there is excellent. And again, I had an example of doing this in one particular role. I remember one guy always said to me, he's like, Andrew, your presentations are great. They make it really clear. But let's be honest, the devil is always in the detail on this stuff. It's always in the detail. So at some point, you do have to dive into that and map that stuff. Because to your point, if we don't have real clarity and alignment on expectations and who does what, built upon a platform of respect and trust, then we do see some problems. So I really like what you said there. Tell me about one of the things that comes up all the time in the work I do and people I talk to is, how much can we replicate what happens in one market in another? And I think my view on this is it's different at different parts of the funnel. But what's your view? How much can we take from one market and put into the other? And is that practical in kind of today's world?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And look, I'm going to speak from my experience in foods and personal care, right? And I guess my guiding thought on this is, us human beings are really not that different. What we, especially in personal care, I think there's some nuances in food, because food can be very, very cultural. What a soup means in Russia is not what a soup means in Brazil. So that I would say is an important thing, but I would always make it insight based as to kind of, where do you vary something? Well, why do you vary it? And what's the insight that's leading you to vary it? So, take diapering babies. Of course, the tools that we use to diaper babies has changed in the last few decades. You have disposable diapers, etc. But the fundamentals of how a parent cares for a baby hasn't changed in about 200,000 years of human evolution. So, there are always those fundamentals, and therefore, innovation, big kind of product or kind of promise innovation should absolutely be able to travel, across markets. The specific claim that you make or how you bring that proposition to life, obviously languages are different and languages have different capacities to communicate. So that absolutely, varies. Where you reach people, obviously, the physical availability as well as from a mental availability perspective, of course, that's going to vary. And there's going to be nobody more expert than the local team on where do we list this and where do we, engage people with this. But, the fundamentals of the concept, the proposition, the product, absolutely, in my experience, can travel. And that goes for kind of strategic brand, long-term brand building, comms as well. You're operating at the kind of the brand fundamentals, the emotional level. That should, by and large, be able to travel. And I think where you are going to vary things, and you need to, it should be insight based. There should be really great evidence and a really sharp insight as to why are we doing this, because resources are limited and precious, and we all want to get our brand out there in front of as many people as often as possible.
Brilliant. I completely agree with you. I think your category distinction there was excellent, because you're right. Food is one. I've done food delivery in multiple markets, and it's just impossibly different in some, right? What works in Brazil is really different to what works in Japan, for example. So I kind of get some of that. But for some of those products, the need is a universal need. And to your point, then the product should be able to travel. The insights and the positioning, et cetera, should be able to travel. It's kind of how you execute that, the expression of how you bring that to life in local culture and local language. And to your point, the physical availability is really driven locally, but a lot of that should be able to travel.
Yeah, and maybe just one little build is what I was trying to say there is insight. By insight, I mean evidence-based rather than opinion-based. And going back to the personalities and those relationships we were talking about, so often you're having a conversation that's really coming down to opinion rather than being rooted in evidence. So needing just to dig a little bit deeper, all partners in the conversation to dig deeper and to really put the consumer first and look at what the evidence is really telling us, why we are going to spend our partnership investment and time on changing this.
That's brilliant. Excellent point. I love that, because you're right. That's often what it gets down to. And one of the things we often see there is my data is better than your data. How do you overcome that? Like, one of my principles for high-performing teams is about having absolute commonality around a whole range of things. A single source of truth for data is one of those. But I'm keen, from your experience, how do you deal with that? Because data is one thing. Agreeing the right source of truth is another. So how do you approach that?
I think it's trying to depersonalize it. So rather than kind of, the conversation being my data, your data, where the source of the data, is to think of it more like a pool of truth or a pool of facts, right? And we're all filling the pool of facts, and there are all lots of good sources for that. And maybe a bit like a lawyer, on the balance of probabilities or beyond a reasonable doubt, what can we agree? But look at the data, put it on the table or put it in the bucket together, and then look at it together. So divorce it from the personalities and be rational, enlightened, reasonable in the literal senses of those words about it, so that you are both searching for insight and truth together. And different sources, have different levels of reliability, but you can then have a reasonable conversation about that, rather than it being, its provenance, like where's it come from, who came up with this.
That is brilliant, Noam. I love that. So it's basically kind of be really hard on the data, soft on the people, put it all together and kind of triangulate, use all the inputs to try and get the most common, kind of commonly agreed insights from that. I love that. I think that's brilliant. It's brilliant. I'm gonna quote you on that. It's a really good quote. I like it. Okay, let's. That's a nice jump into the next section I want to talk to. But I want to jump into innovation, because that's a really lovely segue. But I got one more question about this HQ region country thing. If I was an international marketing leader taking up a new role, or taking up my first time role leading international marketing, and I was stepping into a bit of a mess where, there was conflict between HQ and region and country. And, I was stepping in as a part of my job to fix this. What would be your advice to them as they step into that?
Yeah, I think it's good luck. Is the first thing to say. It is hard. So go in with open eyes, and it is really hard work. I would say that start with the people and start with intent. So check what's in your heart, that and understand what's in other people's hearts. And sometimes we have like bad intentions. We don't mean to, but we want to be right, and that's actually not a good intention. A good intention is to, like we said earlier, find the truth, grow the business, unearth that insight, make the smartest investment. So I think it's kind of engaging with the people and demonstrating, first of all, that you have good intent, that your intent isn't to have one side win over the other. Your intent is to build partnership for growth, for success, for kind of mutual, benefit. And I think that's infectious. And then my advice would be is go around the people first before you start kind of trying to diagnose the people first, build those relationships first, and get those allies. And in that example I shared a bit earlier, I recognized that the marketing director of this country was superb and was relatively new as well, so didn't have too much baggage. And so I made her my ally, and we could look at both of our teams and diagnose where those personalities may have been causing friction and approach it as partners to solve this one team challenge. So that would be kind of my approach is, check, start with what's in your heart, and go for that. And one recommendation, there's a book called Crucial Conversations. Hopefully people can Google that. I can't remember the authors, but it really talks about that and has a very kind of practical kind of process. So read that. You read that once or twice, and you get the gist of this. Of really check your intentions, make sure they're golden, and then you can engage in a much more psychologically safe conversation with people.
That's excellent. What's the name of that book again?
The name of the book is Crucial Conversations. And maybe I can send you the details after this. You can put it in your show notes or whatever.
Perfect. I love that, because I think you're right. I agree with you completely. So setting a really clear positive intention is critical, because that breaks down so many barriers. And the example you gave, it's hard to argue with somebody when your intentions are aligned at that high level. It's hard to get into disagreement. And then also it comes back to where you started that part of the conversation, which is show some respect, build some partnership, get out there and understand people, understand it from their perspective. I think that is critical to success of that. Where I've seen it fail is where people come in and they use their position of authority to say, we're changing everything. This is it. There was no clear intent. There was no building relationships. There was no respect. There was no partnership. It was a very central command and control. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
No, and I haven't, I'll be honest, I haven't worked in that sort of command and control, global, regional, local environment. Kimberly Clark was very much win locally, and the battle was really, you had to earn that partnership. So I think even if you are in a command and control structure and the RACI is all there, treat it as if it's not command and control would be my advice. Earn the partnership.
That is excellent advice. Right, let's jump into the next thing. That's a nice jumping off point. Let's talk about innovation and driving innovation internationally, and especially with this focus on constraints, because especially the world we're in now, we're facing, most of us, unless you're probably OpenAI or somewhere else, facing huge constraints. So you've got some great examples about that. I'd love you to share a bit more about your experience in terms of driving innovation in marketing internationally, and kind of some of how you overcame constraints. And I know you've got an example I'm particularly excited about, which is more of I think it's more of a UK example. But let's start there if we can.
Yeah, let's start with that. So that UK example is on Marmite. Okay, so I was a marketing manager on Marmite, and this is a 100-year-old brand, super famous. So if you want, mental availability, go to Marmite, and it's the sort of brand that every time that Unilever was written up in the press in the UK, this tiny brand called Marmite would always get mentioned as Unilever, manufacturer of Marmite. So, super famous, love it or hate it campaign that I'd taken on. So absolutely standing on the shoulders of giants, and a really privileged position. But the brand had just been growing very low single digits. And it was very reliant on one particular occasion, which is the Marmite on toast. Absolutely delicious. I have it, but I don't have it very often, maybe on the weekends. And that's how it goes with the toast at breakfast occasion. If people are even having breakfast at home, they may be grabbing something quicker, more convenient. So there, in a sense, while there were plenty of Marmite lovers out there, if you're trying to build penetration, you've got fewer points of entry into the brand. You've just got this glass jar with a sticky paste that goes really well with a bit of butter and toast. So that was really the insight. And it wasn't a very large brand, so the resources were quite limited. So the task was, how do I unleash the full potential of this incredibly powerful brand? How do I unleash this potential and actually deliver some growth and some operating profit that, frankly, Unilever wanted to use for its core high priority portfolio brands? Okay, so that was my task. And so I really took this kind of occasion-based strategy, that insight around toast being limited. And so how do we get Marmite to more Marmite lovers on more occasions and give them more opportunities to fall back in love with Marmite and use Marmite again? And there were two strands to this. In the core paste, super good margin, by the way, amazing business model. It was all about extending Marmite usage to sandwiches. Very high volume occasion in the UK. That we're an amazingly culinary culture. So we eat lots of sandwiches, and Marmite is a fantastic enhancer to some very high volume sandwiches like cheese, for example, Marmite and cheese, Marmite and ham, all sorts of very high volume things. So that was really about a kind of core, taking the Love It or Hate It campaign, hiring Paddington Bear to try Marmite for the first time in 50 years and just set aside his marmalade sandwich and try Marmite for the first time. And so that was a Cannes Lion winning campaign.
Brilliant. I love that.
That drove, about 10% extra usage in sandwiches. And the second strand was snacking. And Marmite had experimented here and there, but never really built a business outside of the core yeast extract paste. And so with limited resources, identified occasions in the day. So, breakfast, mid-morning snack, afternoon snacks, etc., and kind of designed a theoretical portfolio. We wanted it to be healthy as well, healthy snacks. And so there were rice cakes and breadsticks, and little cheeses, little kind of cheddar cheeses, bites, and so on. And we partnered with third-party manufacturers because, again, Unilever didn't have the capability. But likewise, we didn't have the sales resources to get into these new categories, so we used distributors. And so Marmite effectively was making net sales in the middle of all of this. And when we got to a certain scale later on, we were able to bring our sales capability in-house and make a little bit more money. So that business succeeded. There were some failures. There was the Marmite cereal bar, which was just frankly disgusting. We tried our best. But, that business added 10 million pounds onto the value of Marmite, about 25% onto the value of Marmite within just 2 years. And 15 plus years later, it is still going strong. And those teams at Marmite are still building on and evolving this snacking business. So I'm super proud of the growth that I drove while I was there, but I'm even prouder that this is actually sustained for multiple years. And again, with just, a couple of us in marketing, a really fantastic leadership team, great manufacturing and people, but really a small team with very small resources, unlocking the growth. And overall, we ended up with 11% cumulative annual growth rate on Marmite over 3 years. So sustained our business in that core as well as that innovation-led growth.
That is such a great example of just great marketing, because you've got everything in there. You've got product innovation, you've got promotion in there, you've got a new distribution model for your placement. It's just got everything in there. And I love the fact you didn't have many resources. You went right back to the consumer. Where was its great strengths and where were the opportunities to make it more available to consumers? It's such a great example. The only problem I have is it's Marmite, because I'm Australian and I'm a Vegemite man. And Marmite is disgusting. Vegemite is the king.
Okay.
But I still love your example. It's a brilliant case study of marketing. But and that is an amazing brand. I have to say, Marmite is what a privilege to work on a brand like that and to do such innovation like that. And I will forgive you, even though even though it's Marmite, I'll forgive you because of my commitment to Marmite. Tell me about that though a little bit more. What was the moment that you kind of unlocked this insight into actually this huge opportunity to extend the usage situations into snacking? What was the process and how did you unlock that?
Yeah, well, even though this was, I think, before How Brands Grow was published, it was just a recognition that we needed penetration. And we know because there's people like you who hate Marmite out there, quite a lot of people, in fact, we knew that this isn't going to be a brand for everyone. And we need to find these Marmite lovers, these toddlers who had Marmite and their parents were wise enough to give them Marmite and still loved it, but just, had forgotten about it or it had slipped to the back of the cupboard or whatever. So it was just knowing that the driver of growth, the primary driver of growth is going to be penetration, and then really saying, well, what are the barriers to that penetration? Clearly wasn't awareness, right? And it wasn't kind of brand power or whatever you want to call that. So that was kind of super obvious. It was just that people didn't have a chance to use Marmite. They would have loved to, but they just didn't have the time or the opportunity. And I think that is kind of starting with what is your growth lever, and then understanding and using, kind of some insight, a bit of intuition, and then a lot of data as well, to really be very crystal clear around the barriers, and then go after, with all hell for leather, how do I knock down those barriers? How do I leave no stone unturned? How do I don't take no for an answer? Companies like Unilever have some very good processes, but they could also, get in the way. I have to say, the thing that did make it easier, and I thought this was a really amazing thing that Unilever did at the time, is that they gave us this incredible freedom. They knew that these local jewels are not the kind of big global core brands. And they, while I was there at least, formed this kind of almost the sort of business unit, the separate business unit, sort of entrepreneurial, almost like a little PE business unit. And we were just told, deliver this operating profit. How you do it, we don't care. And it just gave, my team leader and all of us effectively formed this mini board of this company, quite a significant company actually, with little Pepperami, Bovril as well, and said, right, how do we unleash the growth of these incredible brands that, understandably the rest of the business can't prioritize, but how can we create fuel for growth for the rest of Unilever and have fun while at it? And we had a lot of fun.
Great example. So there's a couple of things I want to pull out of what you just said. One is the company leadership gave you full autonomy and empowerment to address this challenge within some guardrails, I'm sure, but they gave you empowered you and gave you autonomy. The second thing I really like what you said is kind of really understand what your growth drivers are, get back to what your real growth drivers are. The point that you really understood your audience as well. Marmite is not for everyone. So, the other options are not really there for us. And then once you understood it was penetration, well, how can we really effectively drive much greater penetration with an audience that already loves us? It's just so many learnings in that for any category. It is such a lovely model. Okay, what was the biggest thing you had to say no to in that example? Right? Because when you're in that, how do we drive it? There would be tons of options. There would have had to be a lot of stuff you had to say no to. How did you kind of approach that? What's an example of that?
Yeah, I think probably should have said no to the cereal bar. It was my idea. So, but, I should have said no to that because ultimately, while we tried really hard, I refused to admit when we launched it that it just tasted disgusting. We launched it. And it lasted a year. So that's what I should have said no to, and stick to your guns. Quality, being the number one. But what I would say is that there have been experiments with like Marmite chocolate and various things that other people have done, and I'm all up for experimentation. But at the time we just said no to because we were really clear on the snacking strategy that these are healthy snacks. Marmite is rich in B vitamins. We had a whole kind of health angle in terms of our reasons to believe, and that we would be doing things like rice cakes, breadsticks, cheddar cheese bites, these sort of lunchbox fillers, but on the kind of generally on the healthier side of things. Not, nothing's perfect, right? But that we wouldn't kind of go into odd kind of, for the sake of noise, kind of confectionery and so on and so forth. So I think that's kind of, those are the things that I said no to, and that's what strategy is. Strategy is actually a guide to saying no.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. That is one of the greatest examples of strategy, which is how do we make decisions and what are we going to say yes and no to? And that served you really well, apart from, the breakfast bar, but served you really well. I think that's another great example. There's so much we can all learn from that example. Right. Let's jump to leadership. You've got an incredible story about your leadership model, and you talk about care for performance, which I think is fantastic. And you've got a great example of kind of where that came to the forefront of your leadership style, and how it really served you, how leading through a crisis that served you well. And I the reason I want to explore this is because I think this is a really important topic right now, as the world is changing, as job security is changing, as technology is changing the way we do things. I think this people-centered leadership is I think it's going to be critical to the great leaders and the great companies of the future. But I want to know kind of a bit more about how you got there and kind of how you've applied it, especially in times of crisis. And you've got a great example of that. So can you explain to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so just very briefly before I kind of get into the story, a little bit more on what I mean by care for performance.
Yeah,
because
please.
that sounds like a slogan, right? Absolutely.
It does a bit.
Plenty of companies, have these things, right? And, these sort of slogans. And they might say, oh, I'm going to put this policy in place because that will show that we care. That's not what I mean. That's not care for performance. For me, it's about a really daily micro actions and conversations that you take to genuinely, at a human level, care. Number one, for your team, for your peers and your partners, across the business. And it's in those one-to-one conversations. Sometimes they turn into kind of a coaching or mentoring conversation. You help people kind of unlock and break through kind of challenges that they're facing. And it's absolutely about going for meals and drinks with people and building those relationships, and that you are genuinely caring and that you show that intent, really authentically. So I don't have a magic formula for it, other than to say that if it's not genuinely in your heart, you kind of probably struggle with it. But, get it in your heart first, and then make sure you're doing it, on a daily basis at a human level. And like I said, when people genuinely feel that care, and I've heard this feedback about my leadership many times from many people, they will start doing extraordinary things when they're under pressure, in a way that's almost, it's humbling, that they do. And I think, the example I'm going to share is a very sensitive one. We all know, and we all remember very vividly, the shock when Russia launched its full-scale invasion on Ukraine, and it's a tragedy that's sadly still ongoing as we speak. Obviously, when that happened, and our Ukraine team is based in Kiev, and so absolutely rightly, the Kimberly Clark corporate priority was the safety of our people as people were fleeing, right, and making sure that they are secure. And thankfully, nobody at Kimberly Clark was hurt in those first very fraught weeks. So that was absolutely rightly the priority, and obviously as colleagues, partners, and friends, that was my priority and our priority. That the people were, they were up in youth hostels and had friends, and some had gone to different countries and managed to get out. So let's be clear, that was the number one priority. Mm-hmm. At the same time, Ukraine was a major market for Huggies, and Huggies was the market leader in Ukraine. And diapers are an essential product for babies, right? It's not some sort of discretionary purchase, and when you go without, it's a huge impact on people's lives. And what had happened when Russia launched that invasion is that about 70% or so of our supply into Ukraine was cut off. And so, in my mind, and this just came very intuitively, I just gave a very, very clear mission to my team, and also with our Ukrainian colleagues, to say that we must get the diapers to the babies. And that means that you're not worried about premium or mainstream or this format. That you just need to get diapers that absorb wee and poo that fit the babies to the babies. And it's also a very emotional mission, right? We work on, sometimes easy to forget, we work for babies. Those are our stakeholders and their parents. And these are parents and babies in a tragic situation, under unimaginable stress and duress. And so if their supermarket shelves are going empty of diapers, that's a crisis for those people.
Yeah, I know.
So that was the mission. And then what I saw with my team having already that foundation of care, suddenly went stretching way beyond their marketing day jobs. I also had a fantastic senior project manager on my team who was ex-supply chain. So suddenly we were getting into sourcing, and really within just a few short weeks, we were able to reset the sourcing and get supply reestablished and work with the rest of the organization to do that. Within just a few months, we'd actually rapidly innovated and plugged holes in that portfolio, so that by October of 2022, and we were able just to kind of get a quick dip of our market share, we'd actually seen that our market share leadership had been extended significantly because we were able to keep continuity of supply and get the diapers to the babies. Obviously, we weren't doing like marketing or anything like that. It was all absolutely about physical availability. And I'm proud of the business's result, but most of all, I'm proud that, a good number of Ukrainian babies, were able to get diapers of whatever shape and whatever brand. Frankly, didn't care about that, but that as market leaders, we had a responsibility to get diapers to the babies, and so that's really changed my leadership, and it's I wouldn't wish that upon anyone. But sadly, in this world, as you say, Andrew, and in a region like EMEA, where it's a troubled region, these things will come up. And so I think giving a heartfelt, clear, crystal clear mission, and then trusting and empowering your team to go off and solve that, and giving them the psychological safety and the clarity to unleash their genius and their energy on this crisis.
So clear. And wow, what a situation. And full credit to you and Kimberly Clark for what you did in that situation. I mean, that kind of brings it all home, what we do, doesn't it? Right? And to your point, it wasn't marketing. And I love the point you made is we forget we serve babies and their parents, right? And the way you innovated and drove that single-minded focus to just get the product there regardless of anything was amazing. I think you also, there's some real learnings for all of us as leaders in there in crisis. You talked about this being really focused and having a very, very clear, simple mission, which was just get the product there, fix the supply chain blockages or the sourcing and get the product there. You then empowered the team just to get on and do it. And also you were super clear already in kind of making an environment where they felt safe, they could take risks, they could take initiative, etc., which I think is what you were talking about, your care for performance approach. What else did you learn about yourself in that crisis?
You know what? Before that, I really told myself a story that I'm not that great in a crisis. I had a sort of a self-limiting belief. I I like to think strategically, right? I like to be insight led, and I enjoy working in kind of that brand strategy innovation space, and I'm a big believer in having clear strategies, really rich roadmaps that are kind of agile and flexible, and that makes decision making much faster, better, and it leaves the bases covered. So I'm still very much that, and that's the story I was telling myself. But it changed me, and it changed my perspective on myself, that actually, when push comes to shove, back against the wall, I have my priorities, right? The people, number one. And by the way, our Ukrainian team are absolute heroes in that situation. Nobody would have expected anything, of them other than just to keep themselves safe. But they really rose up like lions. They were incredible. And I'm very humbled and privileged to have worked with those people and count them as my friends. So it gives me confidence to know that naturally my heart's in the right place. The people coming first, and my ability really to kind of distill a very complex, volatile, situation and bring clarity into it, and simplicity, not and clarity without being simplistic, right? Acknowledging complexities, being simple, not simplistic, in that situation. And I think that gives me a lot of confidence that, heaven forbid another crisis comes up, I'm naturally well equipped if that happens.
Wow. So your learning is you're much better equipped than you realize.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting point you make about being simple but not simplistic in those situations. I completely agree. Unfortunately, I've also had to lead marketing in companies through some existential crises. And that single-minded focus and that creating an environment of absolute transparency and focus and an environment of psychological safety is just fundamental. When all the ground underneath you seems to be shaky, having that is just fundamental. So I completely agree with you on that. No, our time is almost up. There's so many questions I still want to ask you, but we just don't have time. Before we go, I mean, we've covered a lot, right? So we've talked about the key to leading internationally, and you talked about that being built on a foundation of respect and partnership and people first, really taking time to understand people, with kind of the policy and the clarity and the races and the daisies important, but the second step. We talked about managing conflict and disagreement in terms of being really focused on the data, using the data, everyone's data, to try and find the right insights and the right way forward. Being really clear when you come into roles like this about establishing your intent and taking time to understand the individual. So really great insights on stepping into international leadership, which I think is one of the most challenging and underrated parts of the marketing world. You also talked about innovation and constraint, and that was really great examples of just really good marketing. Getting back to who is your audience, what is your really strongest opportunity for growth, and then how do you innovate across the entire 4P mix to actually do that, but making sure leadership are on board with that to facilitate that. And then we talked about your leadership style and the value of your care kind of focused leadership, but also kind of how that came to the fore, how having a team that felt that stepped up really quickly in a crisis. And then also we touched on leading in a crisis, that absolute clarity. Don't underestimate how good you are in a crisis, and being very simple and focused, but not simplistic, because these crises are obviously very complicated things. So much to digest. As we wrap up, if you were going to give one piece of advice to a marketer leading internationally or about to step into an international role, what would that be from your very impressive career? And I'll forgive you for Marmite, being Vegemite. But what would be what would be your single greatest piece of advice to help someone be successful in that role?
I would say, if budgets permit, get out there. Get out there into the market, sharing those insights, build those relationships, build those partnerships. And if I might add, be really clear on what your added value in that partnership is, and go in with that intent to partner and to grow together.
Brilliant. That is very, very wise advice. And it reminds me of something Mark Ritson said recently, which was, the best marketers are the ones who get out to the front line.
Yeah.
And I completely agree with it. I mean, that's where our customers are, right? And that's where the rubber hits the road in terms of delivery.
Exactly.
I didn't agree with everything Mark says, but that I agree with.
I'm happy to be in the same sentence as Mark Ritson.
And that, I think, is a perfect way to wrap up today. Noam, I want to thank you for your time. You've got so much wisdom to share, and your examples are exceptional. There's a lot any marketer can learn in any category, in any part of the world, in terms of leading internationally, especially where the focus is more on the front line than the center. And I think your lessons, your principles for success, your advice has been excellent. So a huge thank you. And I wish you the greatest of success going forward.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. And it's just been a real privilege and a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Brilliant. You have been listening to The Global Marketing Leader with me, Andrew Garrihy. For more conversations like this, follow the show and connect with me on LinkedIn.